So the next step is I created my VLANs. The next step is that what I want to show you is the QoS configuration. Like we talked about earlier, the question that I got earlier, in the Nexus 5K, I need to configure this using all kinds of difficult policies. And that's called network QoS policy. So actually, this is a Nexus 5K. So I can do the exact same thing here. I have that same QoS configuration here as I would have on my Nexus 5K. QoS, when you boot up the system, when the system is initialized first, you see the following QoS configuration, which is the default QoS configuration for any Nexus 5000. 5500, I mean. So only the classes that have checkboxes in front of them, those will be in my QoS policy. So let's check that on the CLI. I do that via a show policy map command. And because this is system-wide, usually I can say show policy map interface and then specify the physical interface that I want to see the QoS configuration for. But in this case, I want to see the global configuration related to the whole system. So I say show policy map system. Behind that, I can specify a certain type of things. Now, in this case, you want to see the network QoS settings. And here you can see that I set an MTU of 2158 for class FCOE. And for class default, I set an MTU for 1500. I do allow for flow control to happen, but I will allow drops in that queue. If we do another show policy map, system type queuing, for example, I see the bandwidth percentages. So both input and output, they will both be configured always equal. For FCOE, I reserve 50% of the bandwidth. And for all the other traffic, the other 50% is used. So here is my configuration for the QoS setting. How does that translate to the GUI? As you can see here, I have a checkbox in front of the best effort class and in front of the fiber channel class. So that's my class default and class FCOE. And here I say 50% of the bandwidth, 50% of the bandwidth. Use normal MTU, so 1500 bytes, and use the FC MTU it says here, which is 2158. A maximum fiber channel frame is 2112 bytes. And because of FCOE, some overhead is added to that. So also the vSAN header adds some overhead, of course, and then combined with some FCOE overhead with the VLAN tags and stuff. So I add a VLAN tag here. That comes to a total of 2158 bytes in the maximum point of view. So that is going to be my default fiber channel MTU. And this is going to be the default configuration that I cannot even change. So I cannot disable FCOE and I cannot disable the best effort class. That's always going to be there. If I do not run fiber channel over Ethernet to my blades, I will still see that here. So if I want to remove fiber channel completely from my network, I just do not reserve any bandwidth for it. So if you do not run FCOE in your blade systems, and you only run it using NFS, for example, or iSCSI, you can disable that fiber channel queue by just setting the bandwidth to none. So pay attention to that. If I check the configuration right now, you'll see that there is no guarantee for FCOE traffic and that 100% of the guarantees are given to the best effort class. So in this case, I do want to run 50% of the bandwidth. Now, the only difference in configuration-wise between the Nexus 5K and the UCS is that I do not configure percentages, but I configure weights. And this is very complicated. In the lab, they will probably not go in depth and let you configure all kinds of different things here, and they will probably tell you how to configure it. But what it means is that if I have these numbers here, and they will calculate how much percentage rate that translates to. So what I do is I count all these numbers up. So I add them all together and I divide them towards the total. So in that case, I get a relation from the number here and the percentage value there. If I would give them if I would give 3 queues number 3 here, that would translate to 30% for each queue. If I would configure them all having 6, that's an even deviation, so I divide them, the percentages, evenly. So it says 5 and 5. I could have done 2 and 2, for example. Because 2 and 2, or 2 and 2, translates to the same deviation. It's the same, so 2 plus 2 is 4, divided by 2 means 50% of the bandwidth, right? That's the half the bandwidth. And I need to use numbers between 1 and 10. So this is complicated. If they ask you to configure a 23% weight in Q1 and a 25% weight in Q2, that's very complicated because you need to calculate that. But this is not a math test, right? It's a UCS test. So they're probably going to tell you either the weight values or the percentage values are going to be very easy. All right. So by default, we only have 2 queues enabled. If I want to enable more queues, I will need to enable them by checking the checkboxes here. So I have given them names. I cannot change these names. These will always be called platinum, gold, silver, and bronze. So let's say I enable the bronze and silver queue, and I apply that. You will see that that immediately changes the percentage values here. So the silver queue now gets the most bandwidth because that has the highest number. If I get, let's say, the task for divide the traffic between the 4 queues evenly, well then just make sure you use the same weight value everywhere. So 5, 5, and now they will all get 25% weight. If I translate that to my, so this was at 8, this one is at 7. Let's check that on the CLI again. And I see immediately that I now have different classes here. So I have the class default, I have the class FCOE, and I have the bronze and the silver class. And they have all their correct bandwidth reservations. Now I can also see how the mapping is done from traffic towards a queue. So if I go back to my UCS configuration, I can see that I configure a certain QoS value or 802.1p bit value here in this configuration. So I can say, all right, I want traffic with QoS number 6 to become in the silver queue. And QoS 3 is always going to be fiber channel over Ethernet traffic. That is going to be the default. I can't change that. Why? Because I have a difficulty with running voice systems right now in my blades. Because voice signaling traffic also uses QoS 3 to transmit its traffic. So there my problem exists. Normally in a data center I would not see a lot of voice traffic unless I use UC on UCS, but in this case we do not need to prepare for that. All right, so we talked about enabling more queues here, about allowing packet drops, the weight deviation that you need to do to enable the weight percentages of the QoS classes. But what we did not discuss is jumbo frames. If I want to enable jumbo frames in my UCS system, I need to configure that per queue here. So I have 2 given values, the normal, which is 1500, and FC, which is 2158 MTU. I can change this to 9216, which is the maximum amount. If your lab tells you to configure jumbo frames, that means if they say jumbo frames, it means setting the value to the max. Because do not go to the proctor and say, all right, what do you mean with jumbo frames? They will say, well, jumbo frames, right? Just put the max. If they ask you to configure a large MTU size, put the max. The max is 9216. And I can configure that per queue. So as you can see, we now only configured that for the best effort queue. And as soon as I apply that configuration and I check the CLI again for network QoS, you will see that the silver and the bronze queue still only support the 1500 byte packets. The FC queue supports the fiber channel MTU size, and the class default now supports jumbo frames. And as said, this is a global configuration. I cannot do this per interface. I can only do this globally, per QoS queue. So I can enable another queue, for example, for 9216. So let's say the bronze queue, do 9216 here as well. And I want to do 4500 bytes in the silver queue. I wouldn't know why, but if they, by the way, if they ask you to configure jumbo frames, they probably tell you enable jumbo frames. If you have enabled 4 queues here, you will need to enable jumbo frames in all these queues because they did not specify which queue they wanted. Do not think that it's only meaning the best effort traffic. Ensure that you allow MTU size 9216 in all the queues. And what they will probably tell you, along with configuring jumbo frames, they've probably told you this in your data center networking configuration. So when you started to configure the Nexus switches in 9 a.m. in the morning, and then 2 p.m. in the afternoon, you're finally reaching the UCS portion, they will not tell you again to configure MTU sizes. They already told you that in the networking part. So assume that your UCS is going to be complementary, or it's going to be connecting to your network, right? So you need to make sure that your MTU or your QoS settings match between the network and the UCS. All right. So again, MTU sizes, make sure that your QoS settings are equal between your data center network and your Fabric Interconnect. And don't think that because they did not tell you to configure it, it doesn't mean you have to comply with your QoS policy that you have on your network. So, as I said, I configured 4500 bytes MTU size in the silver queue, 9216 in the bronze queue, and in the best effort queue as well, 9216. So I applied the changes. If we check the CLI, and now we see that in the silver queue, I allowed MTU 4500, 9216, and 9216 here. So that's QoS. That is the first part of QoS configuration. As I said, there are 2 places where you need to configure QoS. So first of all, in each of the queues that I need to enable it on, there I need to enable jumbo frames or any kind of MTU size that I need to configure. But there's another place. And we'll come back to that.